just had the most amazing short break in Donegal in the west of Ireland. I was staying in the small village of Glencolmcille, which is on the busy coast road between Donegal town and Killybegs. I was staying with some friends. Oh, there's two of them now. And we packed in an enormous amount. Our first outing was to a place nearby, St John's Point, which is at the end of a peninsula that stretches out miles into Donegal Bay. Of course, there's a lighthouse here, one of some 70 run by the Commissioners of Irish Lights, and this one you can stay in. During my few days in Donegal, it was really windy, but this was great because it gave us some spectacular effects with the sea. There were occasional overcast skies, but mostly it was sunny. On the land next to the light were arrangements of stones, and it soon became clear that these spelled out a number and a word, Era 70. This was one of more than 80 extraordinary markers created round the coast of Ireland at the insistence of the Americans during the Second World War, so that pilots could get their bearings. The one here was whitewashed only a few years ago, but it seems that the wind and the weather have scoured the stones clean. Back up the peninsula, as the sun came out, we saw one of the countless ruined castles and fortified houses that you come across in Ireland. This one is called Glen Castle and was probably built in the 15th century by mercenaries from Scotland, the McSweeneys. So what I discovered was that the name Donegal comes from the Irish Donnigal, which means the fort of the stranger. And who were those strangers? Were they the English? Well, no, though some of them were certainly rather strange. They were, in fact, the Vikings. Over 1,000 years ago, some Vikings must have made it this far west and built a fort here, and some say it was right in the centre of what is now Donegal town, and it's under Donnigal Castle, a much more recent building, only dating from the 15th century, built by one of the heads of the O'Donnell clan. It's been superbly restored in recent years and is well worth a visit. This is what the great fireplace used to look like, and this is it now. And the magnificent wooden ceiling on the top floor is really worth seeing. So, on to our next destination. Donegal has many islands off its coast, and it wasn't long before we were leaving Burton Port on the ferry to get to one of them, Arranmore, Donegal's largest inhabited island. On our way, we sailed between lots of smaller islands with names such as Duck Island and Goat Island, though I didn't see any goats or ducks. Soon we arrived at Arranmore's main port, Slieve, on the sheltered side of the island, and we made our way across to the side exposed to the Atlantic. And what a sight! There was always great excitement in the car when we arrived at a new destination, and the dog was excited as well. Here there is, of course, another lighthouse, but nearby is something quite extraordinary, something not signposted, and you just have to know it's there. Trek across some rough ground with the wild sea below and the lighthouse way behind, and soon you come to this. The lighthouse steps, an amazing stairway which climbs up some 250 feet from the sea. There were glimpses of the sea on the way down, and for a moment it looked far enough away, but the wind soon brought it closer. Some salt on the lens there, I think, but what a place. I didn't actually count the steps because I thought it wise not to go all the way down, but still, the views were amazing. then back just in time to catch the ferry and to watch some expert reversing. We were on the Red Ferry, and we passed the rival Blue Ferry on its way to Arranmore. I was really intrigued by some of the garden walls that the island houses had. They certainly don't want their neighbours looking in. But some of the houses really looked very impressive and must have had fabulous views. On Rutland Island, we could see the ruins of buildings from the late 18th century when a fishing industry was started. But it didn't last long, and although the island was inhabited into the 20th century, the houses today are entirely holiday homes. The colourful concrete markers indicating the passage make it clear that you really need to know what you're doing sailing through here. But we were incredibly lucky to have a hugely experienced pilot on board to keep us safe. I didn't have the heart to tell him that it wasn't actually connected to anything. Soon we were back at Burton Port and on our way to one of the most extraordinary sights in the whole of Ireland, the cliffs of Slieve League. The name means the mountain of the stone pillars, and as it rises up from the Atlantic, it creates some of the highest sea cliffs in the whole of Europe, nearly 2,000 feet high. Now, I don't want to sound too pretentious, but about 25 years ago I did some filming in this part of Ireland for Duke Marketing from the Isle of Man in a helicopter. And I've looked out some of that old footage because I actually flew along the tops of the cliffs where there's a walk called One Man's Path, because it's on a knife edge, and if you meet anyone, you have to be very careful how you pass them. A misstep could send you tumbling down into a loch on one side, and on the other a slightly more sudden descent, some 2,000 feet into the Atlantic. The small loch at the main viewing point should drain into the sea, but the wind was so strong that its waterfall was being blown back again, and through the mist you could just make out a small square tower. This is one of the Napoleonic signal towers, some 80 of which line the Irish coast. Each one could see the tower before it and the one after it, and they used flags and other devices to communicate. But of course, old Boney never did invade Ireland, and many of the towers still stand, a testament to those worrying times. On to Glencolmcille, the birthplace of one of Ireland's most holy men, Saint Columba. We actually stopped here to look at the sea, which was raging in. This whole west coast of Ireland is now known as the Wild Atlantic Way, and on this day the Atlantic was certainly wild. Just think, these waves have come all the way from America. Though nowadays there's lots of waves coming out of America. We went on through the magnificent Glenveagh Pass, a perfectly formed U-shaped valley carved out during the last Great Ice Age, and on to an Irish man-made wonder, the ring fort of Grianán, Ailigh, which sometimes translates as the Stone Fort of the Sun. It sits on the summit of Grianán Mountain and dates from the 6th or 7th century, though there's plenty of evidence of the site being used as far back as the Bronze Age. By the time of the early 19th century, the fort had fallen into complete ruin, and what we see today is a reconstruction carried out during the Victorian period, using as much of the fallen material as possible. If the original looked anything like this, then it was indeed a masterpiece. As well as the visiting public, it's a great attraction to serious academics and archaeologists who, they are on holiday. The walls are some 15 feet thick, and when you get inside, you can see terraces with stairs between them. like some sort of arena. There are chambers and passages inside the walls as well. As you climb to the top and look out over the ramparts, there are panoramic views all the way across to Lough Swilly. And so, it wasn't long before we were on the loch, leaving Buncrana on the Lough Swilly ferry. In the distance, we could make out the silhouette of Grianán Ailigh in its commanding position. Soon, we came to the slipway at Mullen on the western side of the loch, and the site of one of the pivotal events in Irish history. On the lawn next to the play park is a striking bronze sculpture by John Behan, which commemorates a famous event now known as the Flight of the Earls. It was from this very beach in September 1607 that a French warship sailed up the loch and out to sea. On board were the Earls of Tyrone and Tyrconnell and the Maguire clan chief. They had with them followers and nobility numbering nearly 100, though they left behind many more of their desperate followers. Their plan was to sail to Europe to enlist the support of Catholic Spain against the English. Bizarrely, while they were at sea, Spain signed a treaty with England, and when the Earls arrived in Europe, there was no chance of any help. They were never to return to Ireland. The Earls died in exile, and their departure was the end of the old Gaelic order in Ireland, and it cleared the way for the plantation of Ulster. On now to a typical Donegal loch set in magnificent scenery, Loch Veigh in the Glenveagh National Park. Halfway down the loch and coming right down to the water's edge is Glenveagh Castle. It was built in the late 1860s by a Captain John George Adair. He'd made his money by land speculation in America and returned to Ireland to create an estate to rival Queen Victoria's Balmoral in Scotland. It has to be said, though, he wasn't the most popular man in the land, as he evicted over 240 of his tenants to improve the view from the castle. Today, you can explore its rooms in your own time. You can see the music room and library, the dining room, the posh bedrooms, en suite of course, and an area that most country houses would have that hosted weekend gatherings and hunting parties, the bachelor's corridor, where the single men were accommodated. But if you were a special guest, there would be somewhere more exclusive, like this bedroom, where the Hollywood legend Greta Garbo would stay on her frequent visits. The estate has a cafe and nearly 40,000 acres of rugged hills and wooded landscape, and it includes a magnificent walled garden. From here it was on to our last destination, but not before a quick stop on one of the famous Donegal beaches with its endless sand. We were on our way to Kilclooney Dolman looking for something rather special. There was no sign to the footpath we wanted, and it took a while to find. And even when we did, there were notices that might put you off going any further. But the only livestock we saw were some sheep and these guys, who seemed very relaxed about us being here. They were sitting next to a huge outcrop of granite boulders, and it was stones such as these that had been dug out of the land and assembled into something quite extraordinary: the Kilclooney Dolman. This is an astonishing achievement made by our Neolithic ancestors some 5,000 years ago. It seems to defy gravity, with the huge roof stone finely balanced on its supports. And you can imagine there might have been some sharp exchanges when the site manager said, Sorry lads, but we're going to have to lift the top again to put a wedge underneath to stop it slipping off. What makes this dolmen rather special is that there's another smaller one nearby. It's all part of a complex Neolithic landscape. There's a sketch of the smaller dolmen done in 1799 which shows the roofstone in position, though it's recorded that it slipped off a few years later, after 5,000 years. The voices and the people from that time have long since faded into the landscape, but their achievements, their extraordinary creations, have lasted for thousands of years. So, 3 fantastic days in Donegal, in which we packed in so much, but there's still so much more to see.